Awkward pause. Hi guys, I'm Amy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be chatting with all of you about the books that I read and judged and ranked for the semifinals of the Booktube prize. I will link all the relevant information down below in the description as to the website and Robert's channel, the lovely gentleman who started this prize, but let's get to the books and what I thought of them. Real quick, I just figured I would mention the books that were in this group. The four that I had to read of the six, because I hadn't read them yet, were An American Marriage by Tayari Jones, Where the Crawdad Sings by Delia Owens, Freshwater by Akwaeke Emeze, Happiness by Aminata Forna, and the two that I'd read are There There by Tommy Orange and A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza. So let's get to all the thoughts. We will continue with the trend of these wrap-ups by starting with the book that I put in the sixth place, or my least favorite of the bunch, working our way up to the book that I placed in the spot number one. I phrased that weird. Anyhow, so the book that I ended up putting in the sixth spot was An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. And this is a book that I puzzled over for a really, really long time. I think a lot of you are familiar with this book. It's been all over the place. It won the Women's Prize this year. And this is the story of a marriage between Roy and Celestial after Roy is wrongly accused and convicted of a crime that we, as the reader, and Celestial knows that he didn't commit. And I think there are some things that Jones does very successfully in this book. She deals with very intense topics and issues like race and assault and what it means to be a victim to some degree. It's very minor, but very deftly handled. Incarceration and all of those things that are very, very hot topics, I think the world over, but especially in the United States. And I think that she handled them all very, very eloquently and wonderfully. At no point do you blame the victim, and neither does Celestial and Roy, of the victim being the woman that accused Roy of raping her, which he didn't do, which I think was really, really well done. But other than that, I didn't enjoy my reading experience of this book. I enjoyed the discussions on all of the topics I just mentioned, but as far as the characters go and the plotting goes, I wasn't interested. Her writing, there's nothing wrong with it, but I didn't find it to be memorable or anything special either. And there were a couple aspects of this book that I just couldn't get on board with. One is that there is this plot twist in the book in which it has to do with Roy's topic, and if you've read this book, I think you probably can guess what it is, that I just didn't think was necessary, nor did I feel that it added a whole lot to the overall story, and could have been left out and made this story more believable, because it is, I mean, honestly, it is a believable story, but that aspect I just didn't like. But my biggest frustration with this book is the main tension that pulls us through this book between Celestial and Roy, that we're getting in letters that they're writing back and forth while he's in prison. So a lot of this book is epistolary. Is the fact that there's tension between the two of them is because they don't communicate with one another. They withhold information, or they sugarcoat things, or they're just completely inept at explaining to the other person how they feel in that moment. And I just don't like a book that's the sole reason that things aren't working, because that's all they had, which means it's easy for it to fall apart. I understand that, but I wanted there to be more between the two of them, other than the fact that they just couldn't communicate. And in general, Celestial and Roy are really terrible people. They're terrible to each other and a lot of the other people in their lives. They make terrible decisions. And I like books with unlikable characters. I really enjoyed A Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne. And that's one of the most unlikable characters I've ever come across. But Celestial and Roy, I was more just annoyed with them and just wanted it to be over. So unfortunately, this book was a miss for me. It definitely has pluses, and I know why people enjoy it, but there were just aspects of the plotting itself that I don't like it, and I didn't like it, which was unfortunate, but I am glad to say that I've read it, but it did take the 6th spot in this round. The book that took spot number 5 was There by Tommy Orange. As I mentioned, I previously read this book last fall, and I had opted not to reread it because I felt like I remembered it well enough since it's been under a year since I've read it. And I think, again, a lot of you know that this story is about a group of people living in and around the Oakland area getting ready to attend a powwow, a regional powwow that's like a very, very large, big deal event for the Native American community. And we follow a whole slew of characters that are all point of view characters. And the point of, like, the writing point of view, like first person versus third person, changes throughout, as does the approach to the writing, depending on who our point of view character is in the moment. And I generally think that can be done really successfully, but overall with this story, I thought it was very distracting. I never felt like I spent enough time with any one character to connect to any one character or to feel for their situation. And the thing is there was a lot of really difficult topics in these pages, and it's not a terribly long book. So I would have loved to seen him pare down the number of characters that we see their point of view directly, because I think it would have been a little bit more focused. Although, that being said, I think a large part of this book is the fact that Orange is arguing there's no one type of Native American, and he's talking largely about an urban group of Native Americans. And I think that was well done in the sense that I completely understood where he wanted to go and the importance of all of their individual stories, but it lacked focus because of the sheer number of characters for me. And again, I didn't find his writing to be anything outstanding. I didn't hate it though either. This was just one of those books that I think so many people were loving it, and then I just didn't love it. I don't hate this book. I don't even dislike this book necessarily. It's a fine book, but I would have liked to see it have a stronger point of view from a couple characters than so many, like how he originally approached it, how he did approach it. So I hope that makes sense. But the book that I gave to spot number 5. Now, for the book that came in at spot number 4, and I have to say I really, really struggled to rank the books 3 and 4 this round. I had similar reactions in the sense that it took me a while to digest them, but very different reasons for why that was. But ultimately, the book that I decided to place in spot number 4 was Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. And this is the story of a girl named Ada who has different spirits or others or gods, which they're all referred to throughout this book in different terms, that live in her brain and in her body and cohabitate her body with her. And this book is largely autobiographical, so there's that portion of this book that I connect with strongly. I tend to really, really enjoy when a book that is fiction is largely based on the author's experiences. And Emezi definitely has had a very different life experience compared to a lot of us. And I think that voice came through very, very strong. But I do have to say that largely our characters that we're following in this book are not Ada. They are the different others or spirits inside of her person. And I found that misleading, especially with the description of this book. I thought it would largely be from Ada's point of view, and it's almost never from her point of view. And I kind of struggled with this book while I was reading it. I found it difficult to follow at times, but upon having time to think about it, I think that's the whole point of this. This is Ada's experience living a life that's not fully her own, and the different desires that she has or doesn't have, and the way that she ends up approaching life, I found to be very, very fascinating. It's a book that I think about all the time. The writing is interesting, and it's different in that this story is not told in a linear sense. We're jumping all over the place, and sometimes you have no idea what's happening, but I think it largely reflected Ada's experience as our character not being in complete control of her body. But the reason that I put this book here and not in the third spot is just because in that moment I had such a hard time following this general narrative. That being said, I do think this book is absolutely fascinating, and I look forward to reading more from Emeze in the future. And I don't think this is a book for everybody either. I think this is for very, very particular tastes. And I have to say now that I've enjoyed this book and I think about it a lot, but there were just portions of it that just made it too difficult to grasp that I think make it to some degree inaccessible, which I want the book to win this prize to be accessible, if that makes sense. That's the second time I've said this in this video, but if you've read this book, please let me know your thoughts because it was very, very interesting reading experience. The book that I put in the third spot ended up being Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This book, again, I think you guys are all familiar with these at this point in the game, but we are following two timelines. The current timeline, or the present timeline, I will say is a investigation of a murder of a local man from a family that's a pretty big to-do family in this small southern area and state. I don't remember what state it is. North Carolina, there we go. And the investigation of that. And then our secondary, or not secondary, but the second timeline is in which we are following, at the beginning of the story, she's a young girl named Kaya, who's growing up in the marsh in a family that is very unstable, and you very quickly, like, the first experience you have with her is her watching her mother leave and then never come back. And ultimately Kaya ends up alone, and it's how she survives in this very, very harsh environment of the marsh, and the people that she comes into contact with, and how her life is very different than anybody else's. And the connection between these two stories was very, very interesting, and I think it was done in a really, really positive, successful way. I think it can be kind of tricky to do dual timelines in a way that's memorable, and I definitely think that this one is. But my favorite thing about this book was the nature writing, and I know everybody has said that about this book, but it really is absolutely incredible. I've never been to the South, so I don't know that I can appreciate it as much as people who have been there or lived there or still live there. And it was a celebration of this region that is not very often thought of. And I found Kaya as a character to be thoroughly fascinating because she's so innocent and really only understands the world through this view of how the marsh works, and the connections that Owens makes between Kaya's feelings and aspects of the marsh I thought was wonderfully done. Although I do have to say, as much as I think these two timelines connect very successfully, there were parts of this, like, I wasn't terribly compelled to know exactly what happened to this man. And in some ways, I would argue that we end up being told things that I'd rather I didn't know, and it was left a little bit more of a mystery. That's just a personal preference, not at all like a negative thing about this book, but something I would have changed, I guess you could say. But this book really, really is a great book. I don't think I loved it as much as other people have loved it, but I think that's largely because I'm not from the South. I don't know that area, but I can definitely appreciate Owen's writing, and I believe this is her debut, so I'm really, really looking forward to more from her. And her character development was not lacking in the slightest, and if you haven't read this one, you definitely should. I think most people would really, really enjoy this story. Also, I forgot to mention that There is the only one of the 4 books that I've mentioned that made it to the next round. And so now it's time for me to talk about the 2 that did make it to the next round, that were my books that made it to the 1 and 2 spot. And for me, there was very clearly a book that belonged in first place and a book that very clearly belonged in second place. Whereas books 3 through 6 were very muddled for me, which was a very, very interesting experience. But the book that I ended up putting in spot number 2 was Happiness by Aminata Forna. And in this story, we are following 2 point of view characters. One is a gentleman from Ghana named Attila that is a psychiatrist who specializes in trauma. And in responding to areas that have suffered different traumatic events or disasters and helping the people there. And then our secondary, or not secondary, I always do this, our second character is Jean. She's an American living in London who studies urban foxes and that population. And this story is about Attila and Jean meeting one another in London and getting to know each other through a kind of odd turn of events in the fact that Attila has a niece who also lives in London who has gone missing. And so he ends up getting help from Jean, who has a whole crew of people that spot foxes for her to help look for his niece and ultimately his niece's son. So his great nephew. And this story is very, very unassuming. It is a story that is completely character-based. There's really no plot. I mentioned to you the entirety of the plot, and it takes a long time for that plot to play out. But Forna's writing is so elegant with these like show-stopping sentences that are absolutely phenomenal. I adored her writing. She has very, very lengthy paragraphs, I will say that, and it's always interesting to me to see what an author does with the length of their paragraphs because I think it really sets the tone for their story. And this story is in no hurry whatsoever. It's just this relationship that starts out between two strangers and ultimately grows into something more than just being strangers. And it also touches on topics like refugees, but obviously the topic of trauma and what trauma means to a person who has experienced trauma, but also what trauma means to people who haven't been touched by trauma. And the crescendo of this book was so well executed. I was completely astounded. I made Aaron sit down and listen to me read the entirety of the end of it because it's just so incredibly done. This book is, as I've said before about a lot of books, it's a quiet book. It's incredibly unassuming, and I don't think that people expect much out of it, especially in the beginning, because I would even say that this book is slow, but the takeaway of this book is completely worth it. And if you like slow books, then I really think you'll love this. But this was wonderfully, beautifully written and accomplished, and totally a book that I think is completely deserving of being in the final 6 books for the Booktube prize. All right, guys, this is kind of anticlimactic because the book that I put in the first place for this bunch was the book that I put in the first place for the last bunch, and that is A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza. I won't go into a terrible ton of detail since I have recently talked about this book, but this is about an Indian Muslim family living in the United States. There's the mom and the dad and then 2 sisters and a brother, and this book opens up at the oldest sister's wedding, which is a marriage of love and not an arranged marriage like they were hoping for their daughter, and in which the younger brother Amar, I believe, yes, Amar sees his family for the first time in 3 years. And this book, honestly, I think it's perfect. The writing is incredible. Some of the best writing I've ever read, I'm gonna be honest with you, and I don't say that lightly. And the execution, the ending, all of it is perfect. I wouldn't change a single thing, and this is just a stunning story of a family and what it means to be a family with the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. And everyone should be reading this book, and I feel like not enough people are talking about it. It's incredible. I will link my wrap-up from the last round up here for you guys if you want more in-depth, but just know that without a doubt, unless The Silence of the Girls, which is the only book that I haven't read from the final 6, is absolutely knockdown, drag out, one of the best books I've ever written. I've never written a book. Read, this is my champion. This is the book I'm hoping to take it all home. Okay guys, there you have it. There are the 6 books that I read and reviewed and ranked for the semifinals of the Booktube prize. I'm really looking forward to finding out what book will take it all home. We will find out in October, which will be here before we know it. I will also link some information down below for any of you who are interested in attending the Booktube Prize Festival that Robert is organizing in North Carolina. Like I said, I will link that all down below for you. I'm hoping to be able to make it. Still trying to work out the details, but fingers crossed I will make the trek and be there for when the winner is announced. But if you guys have read any of these books, please let me know your thoughts on them. I love chatting with all of you down in the comments. Apologies for this video being so long. I was hoping it would be short, but you know, sometimes you just can't control those things. But if you guys like this video, please like it, and if you loved it, please subscribe, and we will see you in my next video. Happy reading!